Hi everybody, I'm Miss Luke. I'm here to talk to you about the Vietnam War. Go! The Vietnam War is going to be America's most long and most controversial war in its history. In order to understand the causes of the Vietnam War, we've got to take it back to the turn of the century. Late 1800s all the way to World War II, we talk about the occupation of Vietnam. Vietnam is going to, for a very long time, be occupied by imperialist countries. And at first, it's France. France has total control over Vietnam, taking all of its natural resources for their own profit and leaving nothing for the Vietnamese. 1941, Japan is going to invade in 1941. France cannot fight Japan in Vietnam because Germany, during World War II, is invading France. France is able to send some supplies to Vietnam, but not a whole lot. One guy who steps up for Vietnam is a guy named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh used to be communist, but when he saw the opportunity to work with France and the United States to fight against Japan during World War II, he's going to take it. He's going to take that opportunity to show the world that the Vietnamese can earn their independence. They hate foreign imperialism in their country, and they see this as a chance to rid themselves of foreigners. World War II, he is going to fight Japan with his followers called the Viet Minh. And after World War II, when Japan loses, he's very excited. He thinks that he's going to win their independence. But lo and behold, France is going to come back into Vietnam and try to reestablish control. Ho Chi Minh, scared that France will succeed, he then turns to the Soviets and China for Big Brother support. Once he turns back to communism, America steps in with the Truman Doctrine, this policy of containing communism at all costs. And America is going to help France try to reestablish themselves back in Vietnam so that Vietnam doesn't fall completely to communism. When France enters into war with Vietnam, it's long and strenuous, and they're dumbfounded that they're not able to blow through Vietnam with ease. With the support and supplies that China and the Soviets give Ho Chi Minh, they're able to withstand French troops. Truman, President of the United States, is going to supply France with just about $15 million over the course of 4 years. Not a whole lot, but America at the time is busy with the Korean War around 1950. America's only putting money towards the war effort for France. But when Eisenhower becomes president, he increases the money. And when it looks like France is about to lose, Eisenhower gets nervous. At the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, France is going to lose. They're going to throw in the towel, and Ho Chi Minh and his followers get really excited. They're about to win. They all end up at the Geneva Accords, which is a peace conference, and a whole lot of countries show up to give their 2 cents. America shows up with Eisenhower as the president, and they suggest that they split the country into 2 halves, North versus South. They're going to split Vietnam at the 17th parallel. And at the 17th parallel, it's going to split Ho Chi Minh and his communist followers in the north, and then you have anti-communists in the south. Eisenhower is going to approve a president named Ngo Dinh Diem, who is going to lead as the South's president. The 17th parallel is only a temporary divide. They plan on having an election where they're going to vote for the future of Vietnam. Well, Ngo Dinh Diem, who is really working for the richity rich, he sees that he might lose, and so he pulls out of the election, calling it unfair and corrupt, when really he's unfair and corrupt. So here you have the Geneva Accords, splits Vietnam at the 17th parallel, and they're going to have an election, but then it's all called off because the anti-communists are going to lose. And because Ngo Dinh Diem calls off the election, he just goes along his merry way, really benefiting the rich and not the poor. He's also Catholic. There's a very small minority of Catholics in Vietnam, where over 90% of the population in Vietnam are Buddhists. So leading this type of religious revolution, Ngo Dinh Diem takes it upon himself to ban all Buddhist practices, and he starts destroying all these temples. Well, 90% of Vietnam Buddhists are going to not be very happy with that. And they start protesting. You have monks and nuns who sit in the middle of these crowded streetways, lighting themselves on fire in protest to the corrupt Ngo Dinh Diem. And finally, so many months burned later, you have JFK. If we look at the progression, you have Truman, who just gave money to France. Eisenhower, who helps Ngo Dinh Diem sit as president in the South and gives him money and escalates that. And now JFK. JFK comes into the presidency and he gives even more money to Ngo Dinh Diem at first. And then you have opposition. You have a lot of people in South Vietnam who don't like Ngo Dinh Diem. And so there's an opposition group that develops called the Viet Cong, or the VC, nicknamed Charlie. And what happens is the Viet Cong reach out to Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh up in the north, in the capital city of Hanoi. And Ho Chi Minh starts supplying the Viet Cong with modern-day weapons that the Soviets are supplying him. And he uses the Ho Chi Minh Trail that intertwines between North Vietnam and Laos and back into South Vietnam and into Cambodia. And these network of paths are able to supply the Viet Cong with the things they need to try to overthrow Ngo Dinh Diem and his corrupt government officials. So many officials die, and JFK sees that Ngo Dinh Diem's gotta go. He is going to approve a plan, a coup, to overthrow Ngo Dinh Diem. When Ngo Dinh Diem is overthrown, you have a series of military leaders that lead South Vietnam. But one thing is for sure. South Vietnam is in the middle of a civil war, which is interesting since the whole country's in a civil war. So you have a civil war within a civil war, and it's not looking good. And JFK, before he's assassinated, he makes plans to pull completely out. Because the South is so crazy and corrupt and in turmoil, he sees that America's involvement might not be the best thing. So he makes plans to pull out. Unfortunately, he's assassinated, and his predecessor, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, then becomes president. And under Johnson, things get really out of hand. When Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president after JFK's assassination, there's just about 16,000 soldiers in Vietnam. By the time Johnson leaves presidency, there's well over 500,000 soldiers. The war is going to get way out of hand. And the reason for this is because of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Congress is going to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which is going to give Johnson full military power to do whatever the heck he wants in Vietnam. The reason why Congress gives him full military power is because of an incident that occurred in the Tonkin Gulf. And when Johnson becomes president, he's wanting to keep an eye on the buildup and the actions of North Vietnam. And he does this by sending in destroyer ships, one of them being the USS Maddox, into the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin in order to keep an eye on North Vietnam. Well, North Vietnam sees this and they send out torpedo boats because they see this as an aggressive action. Well, when the torpedo boats go out into the waters and face the USS Maddox and the other destroyer ships, they're fired upon. And Johnson takes this incident, this confrontation, Johnson takes this incident in the Tonkin Gulf and he takes it directly to Congress. And he tells Congress that the torpedo boats from North Vietnam fired on the USS Maddox. This is an aggressive action and he needs full military power to retaliate. Because of limited warfare rules, he doesn't want to have to make his decisions and then have to wait for Congress to okay them. So Congress passes the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, giving Johnson full military power to do whatever the heck he wants in North Vietnam. With this full military power, Johnson's going to first release a bombing campaign known as Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder is a bombing campaign in or on North Vietnam. When the conflict in Vietnam started to escalate, John would use a lottery pick to draft guys into the war. So you could be someone who was raised as a pacifist type of hippie, who didn't believe in war. And because of law, you were required to register for the draft. And if you were part of that lottery pick, you would be required by law to go and fight for your country, whether you believed in it or not. This caused a lot of resentment, and there were a lot of guys who wanted to try to get out of going to the war. And they did this several different ways. They could get a college deferment, they could go to college, which means that a lot of people who could afford to go to college went, and the rest of the country who could not afford to go to college went to the war. So that means that a lot of the soldiers in Vietnam were the working class, were the poor class. And the nation's going to be divided and feel resentment towards that whole system. If you were someone who was drafted into the Vietnam War, when you arrived in South Vietnam, one of the first things that you would notice is the chaos and turmoil that South Vietnam was in. The Viet Cong were everywhere. It's not your normal fight where you have an enemy line. The enemies are on one side and you're on the other, and it's a clear view. The Viet Cong soldiers knew that if they were forced into a face-to-face combat with an American soldier, they would lose. So they would fight to their advantage using guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is a type of warfare where it's based on ambush tactics, hit and runs type of tactics, where you jump out of a bush or you set booby traps and you come out of nowhere and you hit them here and there and then you jump back into the bush and try to hide. And they used this for the majority of the war. They were very successful, and it frustrated the U.S. soldiers to no end. They were fighting an enemy that blended into the environment. This was the first of its kind where an entire war was fought like this. Morale for the soldiers was going to go way down. And when a U.S. soldier arrived in South Vietnam, one of the first things that he would experience is the turmoil and chaos of the South Vietnamese. It was a type of civil war within a civil war. And one of the things that their generals told them was that they needed to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese themselves, the people. But this was really hard to do because of three big factors. The first, napalm is a jelly-like substance that when you light it on fire, it burns for about 10 minutes or so. Napalm is used to try to burn down the jungle trees. When you have the Viet Cong members that are using the jungle terrain as their hideout, this seems like a pretty good idea. The second factor is Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a toxic chemical herbicide. And the idea was that they would drop Agent Orange into vegetation, into farms, into water supply, in order to take out that resource that was helping the Viet Cong members survive. But what it also does is it's also going to take away clean food and water for the civilians, the innocent civilians that we were there fighting for. The third factor were the search and destroy methods, the missions, that the soldiers would go in on a rumor that a Viet Cong member had infiltrated some village, and they would go in and they would destroy homes of these innocent civilians, some not so innocent, and try to find and locate the Viet Cong members, try to smoke them out, if you will. Well, it destroys people's homes. So when a general tells you that you have to win the hearts and minds of the people of Vietnam, well, at the same time, you're destroying their homes, their food, their water supply, and making life overall miserable for them, that's going to be very hard to do. The year of 1968 in America is going to be crazy. First off, you have the sinking morale of the soldiers in Vietnam. You have a division in America between hawks and doves. Hawks being the people who are wanting to escalate the war to try to quickly win it. And then you have the doves. The doves are the people who want to hit the negotiation table. They're the people who want peace. They're the ones who believe that Vietnam is a civil war between the Vietnamese, that America has no business being in a conflict clear across the Pacific Ocean. They don't believe that with all the conflicts around the globe, that America should be a global policeman. They also think that South Vietnam is corrupt. They don't like the idea of fighting for a corrupt type of government. In the year of 1968, there's some crazy events that happen. You have 2 assassinations in that one year. Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr. You're in the heat of the civil rights movement. So you have urban race riots that are sparked because of the civil rights, because of protesting the Vietnam War. They all kind of go hand in hand. In 1968, there is a backbreaker that happens in Vietnam that is going to spark a ton of protest against the Vietnam War. It's going to occur on the Vietnamese New Year's. It's called Tet. And the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they plan what they call the Tet Offensive. And what happens is for a week long, they call a truce where there's supposed to be no fighting in all these major cities. And they take this celebration of Tet, this New Year's celebration, to really honor the dead that have fallen because of the war. And so the South Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese casualties are transported from the north down to the south. And the Viet Cong use this open truce transportation to honor the dead as a way to get supplies into major cities. And they're successful. So when all the fireworks and celebrations and people hollering and hooting in celebration of the Vietnamese New Year's, you have the Viet Cong who open up those caskets and start setting off bombs everywhere. And they attack these major cities in South Vietnam. Well, when news of this gets back to America, they just light up. They go crazy. They don't understand how their president can be on television at one point saying, we're winning, we have all these casualties, we have the death count, the body count, we are winning, we're really close to being done with this war. And then the next day on TV they see this huge massive Tet Offensive that pushes the Vietnam War for the American cause back another 6 months. It takes them 4 to 6 months to regain control of those towns in South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive changes public opinion is what it does. It helps further divide the nation between hawks and doves. In 1968, Johnson also announces that he is not going to run again for president. This opens the door for a new type of candidate to step in and try his luck at the Vietnam War. And this candidate is the Republican Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is going to, in 1968, run on a platform of bringing back law and order in a very chaotic, divided America. He also promises that he will end the Vietnam conflict. When he's elected, the first thing he does is he announces his plans for Vietnamization. Vietnamization is this idea that he will gradually bring back the soldiers from Vietnam. But it's tricky because he has to be able to end the conflict without losing America's honor. And he does this with the madman theory. And what he does is, as he's taking soldiers out of Vietnam, he's bombing like crazy North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And he does this as a part of sending a message to the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese that America is really capable of going in and just annihilating them. But we are choosing to wrap it up and go home. This is going to force the South Vietnamese to really own their civil war, to really see how much they want their independence. When America hears Vietnamization, they love the plan. They want the war to end, and this sounds like a very reasonable plan. But what he doesn't put in the papers or right in front of them is the fact that he's going to bomb Cambodia and Laos. And when he does this and the news gets out to the American people that he bombs Cambodia, they go crazy. You have college campuses that break out in riots, protests that are very aggressive. One very aggressive protest ended up on Kent State University in Ohio. And these kids were protesting on the campus, and Nixon felt it necessary to call in the National Guardsmen. When the National Guardsmen came, some students started throwing rocks at them. And when you throw rocks at National Guardsmen, anything can happen. When students started throwing rocks at these National Guardsmen, some guardsmen started opening fire on these students, and 4 ended up dying. There are certain lessons that we can learn from Vietnam. Number 1, war equals death. There were 58,000 Americans who were killed and over 300,000 that were wounded. Finally, because of Vietnamization and Richard Nixon, most of our guys have officially come home. And when our last few troops leave Vietnam, the end of the war is at hand. North Vietnam promises not to invade South Vietnam, but not many government officials truly believe that. And sure enough, in 1975, after Richard Nixon is impeached, you have Gerald Ford, who is our new U.S. president. And in 1975, North Vietnam is going to launch this massive invasion of South Vietnam. And they're going to overrun Saigon, which kind of marks the end of their civil war, uniting all of Vietnam and creating one communist country. Today, they are still communists. But in 1975, President Gerald Ford had to decide, do we go back in and protect those guys, or do we just let it be? And Gerald Ford is going to choose to let it be. When the veterans return home, oftentimes they're greeted with a very cold homecoming. There were no parades, there were no confetti celebrations. Some of them, there are stories where some veterans return home and they're spit on. They're called baby killers for such stories like the My Lai massacre, but that wasn't the case for all of them. A lot of the soldiers had to deal with PTSD, coping only through drugs and alcohol, or suicide. There were certain American policies that changed because of the Vietnam War. The first is the draft. They're going to abolish the draft completely. Guys still have to register when they turn 18, but as far as drafting them, whether they want to go or not, they don't have to do that. The War Powers Act is going to be passed as well. This is going to prohibit a president sending our troops in somewhere without informing Congress. They can still send troops in, but they have to inform Congress within 48 hours of doing so. And the second part of the War Powers Act is that after sending our guys, we have 90 days to decide if we're going to declare war or not. And at 90 days, if we don't want to declare war, then our guys, but declared by this act, they get to come home. And finally, the legacy of the Vietnam War and the biggest effect of it is the cynicism. The American public is no longer going to look to the president and blindly follow and blindly just accept the decisions that he or she makes. Because of the Vietnam War, people are going to question the government. They'll never fully trust the government ever again. So that's it. That's the Vietnam War. Peace.